Welcome to Interview, the Recruitment podcast. The experts you'll hear from are John Geltema, who will speak from the recruiter's perspective, Mark Bassett, who represents the candidate's perspective, and Debarshi Chaudhary, who will address the tech employer's perspective to the discussions. In this episode, we will cover the hot button topic of immigration, specifically as it relates to the technology industry. We will focus on the ramifications of sponsoring work visas like H-1Bs for companies, the impact of recent policy changes, and the broader question of what is the optimal model for getting skilled technologists into the country without reducing opportunities for Americans. Now, let's get started with the very broad question. Should companies looking for tech talent consider sponsoring H-1B visas? John, let's kick it off with your perspective first.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you don't have the tech talent you need that are Americans, they're not available, price is too high, whatever it might be, you've got to open the doors to H-1 sponsorships. And granted, and I don't know all the ins and outs about it, but there's a lot of requirements to continue on to sponsor and to continue on to look for American-based or U.S. citizen-based talent. But if you don't have that, and of course, the urgency of a project or a product that needs to get out, you got to consider the H-1B sponsors or candidates.
And that's my take on it as well. I mean, and I'll give you some real statistics around this. Essentially, if we're hiring for, let's say, a Java programmer with some level of experience, we frequently run into situations where we'll post an ad and we'll get 50 candidates, and maybe one of them will be a not H-1 candidate, right? A green card holder or a citizen. And it becomes very, very difficult as a tech company, if we have urgent development work, to basically ignore the H-1 pool, because that's the biggest pool of talent that's out there and that's available and trained to the level where as a small to medium business, we don't really have the money to train somebody from scratch on our technology. So we want somebody with a level of experience who can come in and start working and be productive day one. And that's something that absolutely, I mean, this is something that without the H-1B pool, our only alternative is actually to go offshore, and which I think is even more counterproductive for the American talent pool. It's like that's the last thing you want. You don't want jobs to go offshore. You want jobs to stay in the U.S. And the only way for us to scale up our projects is by going the H-1 route. Now, granted, of course, I mean, it's not a cheap, easy, or even inexpensive route. I mean, there's this misconception, I think, in the industry that people hire H-1B workers because of lower costs. That's almost never the case, especially when you factor in fairly significant costs around immigration fees, legal fees, and the like. You actually end up paying more for an H-1 candidate or an H-1 employee than you would for an American citizen. You also have to factor in things like essentially the fact that if you don't need a programmer anymore, let's say, if you have a project for 6 months and you hire an American person, it's very easy to make that person leave. I mean, you can just fire that person, you can end that project. For an H-1 employee, it becomes a bigger process because you still have to continue paying them while they're not working until you find another project and so on. So it's definitely not money. It is the pool that is the reason why employers turn to H-1Bs, and that's something that is definitely from a small to medium business perspective something that is needed. Now, I understand that there's also the perspective that, hey, if we go this route, then a lot of the American talent that is coming out of the universities may not get hired, or maybe may have to wait for their jobs, for the chance in the market. My counter to that really would be, especially in today's job market, I really don't know of anyone who's a programmer, or at least somebody in the tech industry who has capabilities and is willing to learn new stuff. I can't think of a single person that I've met who can't find a job fairly quickly. It's definitely not a market where people are waiting around because they don't have jobs or opportunities. So from my perspective, it's absolutely critical that the H-1B program be continued and that employers look at it as a viable option.
I gotta disagree with that, Devarshi. At least from the entry level perspective, and in my experience, when we've got technical positions or developer roles, yes, the market is saturated with H-1Bs, and probably in terms of experienced people, less than 5% are green card holders or U.S. citizens. But when even for a mid-level position, I'll have an inordinate amount of recent college grads who admittedly don't qualify. And I get that, right? I mean, they don't have the experience. They've got a comp sci degree or a math degree, and they're looking for their first opportunity. And they're, because they're not qualified, they're not going to get it. But how much more likely might they get an opportunity and get ramped up and trained if they don't have a competing pool of H-1Bs available?
Yeah, I agree with that perspective. It's just that it's almost, I would say, it's upon the big companies to do that job for us, in a sense. And I know I'm probably being unfair to them a little bit, but it's almost a company that is small and growing, or a startup, or a medium-sized business. We just can't afford to train somebody on while they're picking up the skills and the experience to become a productive resource. That's the reality, because tech talent is expensive, and if we're going to be paying them the salaries that they're expecting when they're coming out of college, all the small to medium-sized businesses will just go bankrupt if we have to basically spend 3 to 6 months training people on the job. So yeah, I'm sure the Apples and the Googles and the Microsofts and the Facebooks can afford to take them in, and they have the cash resources to ramp them up, and that's amazing. But for the people who don't have that kitty, we need alternatives. And as I said, I mean, really the option for me personally, when I'm doing product development for my company, is I can either hire H-1Bs who will come and be productive day one, or I can take the whole thing offshore. But there's really very little leeway other than those two extreme options, in a sense.
So I think honestly that the U.S. has not done enough to really emphasize STEM as education across the board. So our resources are limited, especially on the technology side, the software side, and there's a lot more offshore options than there are U.S. based. So H1's got to be there because of that. But if the U.S. spent more time putting money into driving and emphasizing the education of our up and coming, our kids that are going to be graduating in the next number of years, we're going to have more of a pool and probably less of a need for H1. But that's not where it's at. Right now, it's just not an emphasis in the U.S. And it should be like English or math or whatever it might be. Computer science should be on should be not just an elective in most high schools. It should be a requirement. 20 some odd years ago, when I was in middle school, and emphasize the some odd, but I was required to write on an Apple IIe and write in basic code, but that's not even required in middle school now. At least not in Southern California. So it shouldn't be elective. It should be a requirement. It's learning to use a different side of your brain and building up the future of the U.S. and the resources that the industry needs. Right now, the industry has to go after where the resources are. And a lot of that, oftentimes is offshore. in terms of, H-1B sponsorships.
Yeah, if I could have done it over again, I probably would have encouraged my kids more towards a technical education. Historically, it just seems like college is the opportunity to get a broad liberal arts education, but that's not going to solve our tech problem. To what Debarshi said about the smaller companies, I totally agree. And my perspective is going to be geared to that because most of my clients are startups. The challenge is a cost issue too, though. And it's a cost issue and it's a communication issue. If you're a startup, you're early stage, you don't have the luxury of a big bench or depth. Communication skills come into play with this too. And I'm not. If this sounds discriminatory, I apologize. It's not meant to be. It's because the same example I'm about to give would be true in reverse if it were us applying for a position in a country with a different language. But, my clients say repeatedly, look, I've got to have somebody who understands what I say the first time and who thinks in the language I speak in. Now, doesn't mean they can't be immigrants, but they certainly need to be that fluent because we don't have the luxury of going back, over and over and over again. From a cost perspective, we're talking to recruiters. If we're going to have our fee associated with this, and I don't know if it's specifically, but the last time I checked, sponsoring H1 was like $8,000 to $10,000 for the hire, in addition to what we're going to charge. So, yeah, I mean that's a huge cost to assure a quicker ramp up than it might be. But I wonder, if that same money was spent taking that recent comp sci grad and putting them through a rigorous training program, what would we accomplish?
I have a couple of points there actually. So one is when you said the communication part of it, especially with whether it's H1 or whether it's offshore. Completely agree, especially with the offshore work that we do, and we would recommend, and we do this as a practice internally as well. We have very strong project management and business analysis teams who are on site, who are with us, who are sitting down with the business leads and the product leads, and it's their job to really communicate with the development team, and not even necessarily in English as you know it, more like technical English is the best way to put it. So yeah, that part of it, completely get that. The other thing, actually, something to just emphasize on John's point. I think one aspect of education that is also sort of overlooked here in U.S. schools, high schools, even colleges, is almost the dirty work part of the tech jobs. And this is something that, again, is not really in the public domain. People don't talk about it. But just like we hear, we need immigrants coming in from Mexico because there's not enough Americans to do the dirty work in the farms and the fields, and you need immigrant labor to actually fulfill that. It's almost, there's an analogy to that in tech as well. A lot of kids that I meet and I interview coming out of schools and colleges, they want to build the cool new apps, they want to build the cool new websites and the products and so on. But a lot of the work that we actually end up doing at high-scale clients is digging into arcane databases, trying to find areas where data is not flowing correctly, or there's reports that are mismatched because somebody mistyped a query 20 years ago. It's dirty work. You don't see the rewards up front where there's this cool new app that comes out and you have 100 million people using it in a month or something like that. It's really, the rewards are in suddenly your reports looking right, and that's something that I think a lot of people in tech who are getting into tech don't appreciate. That is that's work that is absolutely essential, needs to be done, and people don't want to do it. So in many cases, we see that the people we hire who come from abroad are more geared towards that kind of work because that's experience they've gained already in the companies they've worked for, as whether supporting U.S. businesses or whether supporting businesses in their own country.
There's a lot of talk around the abuse of H-1 visas and declining wages, mainly because of companies' practices around hiring H-1B immigrants. So I'm really interested in you guys' thoughts around that.
I can take that on because I know quite a few companies who are who have played around with this, not played around, but have suffered from this, and is the best way to put it. Essentially, as I just mentioned, hiring H-1B candidates is not really a cost saver. In most cases, it's more expensive because the U.S. Department of Labor has specified wage rates for almost every position and for every location. So if you're hiring someone in New York or hiring someone in San Francisco, San Jose, the Bay Area, whatever, there's very predefined wage rates, prevailing wage rates that you have to pay your employees, especially if they're of their H1s. And these wage rates tend to be fairly high. I mean, a senior level programmer in the Bay Area should be making over 120 grand based on these wage rates. And this will probably be a little controversial, but what I've actually seen happen is even some of the bigger tech firms sort of drive this rate down by forcing their vendors to give them lower rates, because there's a drive to the bottom in a sense where they're looking for lower and lower bill rates, and as a result, their bidding war between their vendors pushes the rates down to a point where it becomes unsustainable, where really the bill rate is almost lower than the prevailing wage rate for that location. So if somebody is working in the San Jose Bay Area and their prevailing wage rate is they're supposed to be paid $120,000, but the bill rate that their company is getting is $65 an hour, then there's obviously something wrong there. That's an unsustainable model. There's no way the company can make any money based on that. So what ends up happening is companies try to get around it by either paying their people less or showing them working somewhere else. I mean, there's a lot of tricks that companies apply to make that happen, and I think it's driven by both the companies themselves and the big companies who are their clients, and it ends up in a big messy situation, which is not good for anyone. It's just a blatant, I would say, you're sort of borderline trying to stick to the law, but in many cases you're not. So yeah, that's there is misuse, there is abuse. In many cases, it can be very easily prevented just by companies being willing to pay a fair wage for the location they're in. And if that's the case, then the abuse would disappear. It's almost always driven by an extra level of greed, and to make that extra buck that causes this.
Boy, the staffing industry sometimes contributes to that too, and it's the part of the staffing industry that I would not really define as the staffing industry. Meaning, for contract positions, you find a candidate, who's posted, and you end up talking to his quote unquote agent, right? He's already sponsored by someone, and that agent quotes the bill rate or the pay rate, but that's not the pay rate. That's the pay rate to the agent, right? So now we're the recruiting firm, third party, we're billing the client, as you say, $65 an hour, probably paying that agent, $50 or less. And then what's he actually paying the engineer doing the work? Probably significantly less than that. So that greed factor comes in there. I don't know. There's another factor too, in terms of abuse in practices. And that's the whole aspect of false backgrounds. I mean, I have John and I will laugh about this. It's we call it the H-1B resume. It's almost always seemingly formatted the exact same way, with bullets on the first page naming every skill technology in the book, and then their client projects. And I know Debarshi can speak to that a lot too, working against that to make sure we can find out is this truly that person. But there's abuse at all sorts of levels. You've got the staffing industry. You've got their sponsoring agents. You've got the individuals who are not really the people that you're interviewing and hiring. It's a hot mess.
Yeah, and to that extent, actually, I mean, technology is a little bit to blame in a sense, because I know how, and you know how it works as well with a lot of the recruiters. There's and we use these tools as well, which basically go to the job sites and pull down resumes based on certain keywords. So effectively, the only way for a candidate to get into the list or even a short list of people that the recruiter looks at is to have every keyword in the resume. So
True.
Otherwise, because the recruiter is not really reading the resumes, right? They're using some automation or some tools to pull them down. And if you don't have those keywords in there, your resume is never getting noticed, even if you're the best programmer in the world. So almost by default, everyone sticks to the same style, the same keywords, the same kind of phrasing in those resumes, because that's the only guarantee that the automated tools will pull your resume down. The other thing that I think we've talked about earlier is just in some of our other podcasts is having that flexibility in the job definition, because a lot of times the clients will just say, hey, I want somebody with 5 years of experience. But do they really mean that? Or if they have a really, really great programmer with only 2 years of experience, is that not better? I would say it's almost 100% of the times better to get a really, really smart guy or gal with no experience than to get a person with 10 years of experience but who doesn't have that ability or that ambition. So now that's something that, again, would get stripped out, or the person, the really smart guy, has no real way to actually get in front of the client without faking their resume, because the resume will never get picked up by a recruiter. A recruiter will never end up calling them for that position. And as a result, they'll never come in front of the client. So it's almost like, and the more we automate, the more that is actually the case, where people just will slip through the cracks unless they conform to whatever the standards are for that job.
What would be a policy recommendation you would make to the U.S. government to improve this overall situation?
I personally would like to say, hey, take the money, take a percentage of the money that you're charging and gaining from sponsorship, and put that into development and training for recent college grads entering the market. I get the impression that once they've graduated college, everybody thinks it's all done, and it's like that's just theoretical, right? They need some actual practice, and so maybe some of the maintenance work or the low interest work that Debarshi's talking about could be delegated to that kind of a group, or some sort of way to engage the ones that we actually do have, so that they're being rewarded for getting a technical education.
I do think if the kids are trained early on in technology and technology practices, and our society overall is kind of moving on from the millennial, or at least moving past it, millennial mentality, if you will, we kind of start building those practices in, then the students coming out, the graduates coming out in the next 5 to 10 years and beyond are going to have that mindset to go in and do the grunt work that needs to get done, and not just be looking for that quick buck app that everybody, Candy Crush or whatever that everybody wants to play. It's really going to have to be a shift in the mindset. And you're right, Mark. I mean, the government needs to put some money into the education system to focus on STEM STEM education at an earlier stage. The ironic thing to me is they have computer class in elementary school. Middle school, they don't. They might have one, but it's not a requirement. In high school, same thing, not a requirement. Why is it that in elementary school, they all have to take it, and then it drops off after that? It makes no sense to me. So I think that the policies have to, and the budget needs to be put, towards that ongoing education throughout the K through 12 experience for our kids.
And I'll take a slightly different perspective here, more from, because my companies have sponsored H-1Bs for employees over the years and green cards. But I'm not a immigration lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, so take whatever I say with that context. So my take is that there's a number of systemic issues with the H-1B, some of which are actually getting fixed as we make progress. For one thing, I believe, at least in this year's new lot of H-1Bs, which is there's a 65,000 or 85,000 allocated every year, they're giving a higher preference to students who have done their masters in U.S. universities. And that's a very good thing, because when people come here to study, they're actually investing a lot of money and obviously their time. And you don't want to give them the message that, hey, come here, spend all your money, and then we can't really guarantee that you can stay here or work here. You might have to go back once you're done. So that's really, and I'm sure the universities hate that message as well. So giving them a higher priority almost ensures that you get the cream of the crop, the people who've actually studied in the best U.S. universities. They get to stay and they get to get the H-1 visas, and they're the top of the line, essentially. The other thing that actually I would say is essentially there's right now the whole green card process. So H-1Bs can also apply for green cards. Used to be, when I came to this country 17 years ago, it used to take 3, 4, 5 years. At least for people from India these days, it takes, where most of the H-1Bs are from. Today, there's like a waiting list of more than 10, 12 years, and some people have no real expectation of getting it using the current process in the foreseeable future. That's an unstable situation. It's not an equilibrium you can sustain. So there has to be something to remedy that. And I've heard of a lot of different thoughts around that. Something like maybe what Australia or Canada follow, where you have a point system, where you award points to people based on their education level, based on the type of job they're doing, how many years of experience they have. And if they meet a certain threshold, you give them permanent citizenship, permanent residency, and so on. So it's that model has to change, because right now it feels, at least from the perspective of the employee who's here on an H-1 visa, it feels very, very nebulous. They have no certainty at all in their future for people who have come in here over the last 3 to 5 years. And that's something that absolutely I would change.
Let's jump into the next segment, recruitment tool of the week. Debarshi, actually, can you speak on this?
Sure, actually. So today, it's not really a tool per se, but just I would call this a series of practices and things that we need to consider. So I was actually at an event yesterday up in Albany, where it was all about using body language to assess people you're talking to, or even interact with people. It was led by a speaker. Her name was Janine Driver. I highly recommend her talks. You can probably catch it on YouTube, and she also offers some courses. But essentially, there was a lot of stuff that I learned from there around how we interact with people, and what are some of the very, very simple things we can do to make our interactions more effective, down to the level of just sitting to the right side of a person, right? When you're talking to them. Apparently, sitting to the left of a person has a markedly increased effect in their perception of you, whereas if you sat on the right, just because of the way most people's brains are wired. The same thing around how you make eye contact, how you shake hands with people, and so on. So there's this obviously, and I'm sure most people are aware of this whole. There's a body of work around the study of body language. but how to make it most effective in business dealings, and that this is true for obviously recruiters on a day-to-day basis while you're dealing with either clients or candidates. It's something that I think every recruiter should try to learn and inculcate as part of their practices, because it's very it can be a very effective and valuable tool going forward.
Is it like a arm wrestling thing? Like if I'm sitting to someone's right, aren't they necessarily sitting to my left, and then they're going to have that disadvantage?
No. It's just the way you want them to perceive you.
Uh-huh.
So basically, if you're sitting to their left, they see you as less threatening in some sense,
Huh.
and it's just because of the way our brains are wired. And there's some research material around this. They've run experiments around this to actually quantify this effect, and it's actually mind blowing when you go through that. And there's other aspects of it, like and this obviously doesn't come as a surprise, but being nice to people, right? There was this really interesting study where they had two people talking to a bunch of people who came in about the same topic, and they were basically talking about movies. And one person was a really nice guy, and the other guy was acting or pretending to be a really nasty guy, and he disagreed with everything the other person said, and so on. At a certain point in the conversation, they started making gestures, right? So essentially, they started acting. They started putting their hand on the top of their head or under their chin. Or they would lean back on the chair, put their one leg on top of each other. And they noticed that for the nice guy, the people they were talking to started copying them because they just wanted to be like him.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Right? Yeah, it was fascinating. And with the nasty guy, they obviously didn't. They wanted to not be like him, so they wouldn't copy him. So it was fascinating how it actually has a tangible, quantifiable effect. I mean, obviously, you know that people react better to nice guys. I mean, that's an obvious interpretation, but the way it transpires is actually very cool to almost watch in person in real life. So things like that. I mean, even simple things like when you're talking to somebody and making hand gestures, the gestures, if your palm is facing them, that's a good thing. If the back of your hand is facing them, that's a bad thing, right? And that also has been quantified. So now what I'm really interested in, and I want to explore this further through either research or just talking to people, is how these studies of body language translates to the electronic world, in a sense. Because as you guys know, a lot of our business and what we do and is now on a computer. We're talking to people using Skype or Teams or whatever. It's almost, I would say, 90% of my human interaction is either through a computer or a phone. So how do the principles of body language translate, right? And either verbally or through videos or whatever the case might be, it's not the same, obviously, but there has to be some analogies on what you can do as you interact with people electronically.
I'm sure there's a Skype etiquette, especially when it comes to interviewing. And quite frankly, I think the body language it's always been pertinent, especially in recruiting. And it's not just for the recruiter and how they represent themselves in person or via Skype, to a candidate and a client, but it also has everything to do with preparing the candidate for an interview with the hiring manager, with their client manager. So, everything from, getting there early, walking tall, having a firm but not too firm handshake, maintaining eye contact. In a panel interview, no matter who asks the question, you want to have eye contact with everybody while you provide an answer. Part of the body language is that, you don't cross your legs or your arms because you'll look closed off. You sit up straight. I mean, there's so many different elements to it. But this is stuff that the 23 years I've been doing this, it's part of the prep, because especially these days, like you said, where everything is moving much more digital and has become such. In way back in the day, we had to meet every candidate in person before we sent them anywhere. We had to meet every client and see their environment so we could properly represent the company to the candidates. And of course, those times we had faxed resumes rather than emailed. But the etiquette in your body language definitely comes across. In Skype and online interviews. But we should be prepping our candidates every single time, especially when they go to on-site interviews with our clients, and how they present and what they do and how they walk and talk and et cetera. So body language is absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, interesting point you said when you mentioned the handshake, and there's something I learned yesterday at the talk. So apparently the best handshake is the one that exactly mirrors yours. So what they suggest from a purely, analysis perspective is a handshake is typically 3 seconds. The first second, you measure the other person's grip and then either increase or decrease your grip to match theirs, right? And that's the key to it. So it's not firm, soft, not too firm or not too soft. It has to be exactly what they're doing.
I can do that unless it's a wet fish or a limp handshake. I can't mirror that. I got to crush that hand. I'm sorry.
See, that won't be effective. If it's a limp handshake, you have to make yours limp as well. Good.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because a handshake I learned a long time ago, is a huge indicator of a person's personality. So if we go meet somebody and they have a wet fish, like you said, Mark, right? Just a light handshake with no grip whatsoever. They're basically just putting their hand out so you can grab it, and that's probably because of the obligation of the situation that they have to do that, or at least they feel like they do, and they don't want to. But that right there tells me they're a passive person. They're submissive to whoever they're interacting with. Probably low confidence, things like that. But on the other side, you got somebody who's highly aggressive that doesn't even wait till your hand gets into theirs before they close on yours, and they're gripping your fingers rather than your palm. And that is the exact opposite. That person doesn't care about you, right? And so there's handshake absolutely is huge. Body language overall, absolutely. The thing is, you can't make a candidate be what they're not. But what you can do is give them tips on how to improve themselves, because that's what they need to do in representing you, or that's what you want them to do in representing you to your hiring manager who's interviewing for a job that you're exclusively working on. You want to make sure that person represents you as well as they possibly can, if not better than they have before, by providing the information to do that. And body language is absolutely part of the key.
Yeah, we're sending out living business cards. That's exactly right. Representing us.
All right. Well, thanks for listening in. If you have any comments or suggestions for the topics that you want us to discuss in the future, reach out to us via email at interview@inamics.com or on Twitter. So we'll be back soon with more content and suggestions about how to make your staffing operations simpler and more efficient.